Thanks for joining the afternoon seminar here in the Institute. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Carrie Cutler, coming to us from Washington State University, Pullman's campus, after training at the University of British Columbia. I have known Carrie through a degree of separation for a number of years, but just had the opportunity to really chat this morning, and I look forward to continued conversation throughout the day. I have admired her work over the last several years. One, creating an inventory to properly assess cannabis use acutely and across the lifespan, her systematic work looking at stress reactivity and regular cannabis users compared to controls, and then just also really innovative approaches to look at naturalistic cannabis use using Zoom, coupled with cognitive testing, and I believe working with some dispensaries to incentivize or encourage the use of certain products, things I imagine you're going to touch upon today. As a reminder, if you have questions, please wait for the microphone for the online audience to hear. If you're online and you have questions, there's a link in your calendar invite or in the emails. Yeah, and with that, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me today. It's my pleasure to be here to share my research on the effects of cannabis use on cognition, mental health, and the stress response. So I'm just going to start with a little background on rates of cannabis use, the different kinds of products people use, and I'll talk about some of the barriers to studying cannabis. And then I'll turn to giving you a broad overview of the 3 different streams of my research program. So I'm going to start by discussing Are we better now? Better now? Yeah. Might have been my hair. Okay. So with medical cannabis now legal in 38 states and recreational cannabis legal in 24 states. And this new legal cannabis industry is absolutely booming. So in 2021, cannabis sales hit a whopping $25 billion, which outsurpassed national Starbucks sales by $5 billion. National sales climbed further to $30 billion in 2022 and are projected to exceed $33 billion when the numbers come in for 2023. And I'll also just highlight here that extremely high potency cannabis concentrates, including those vape pens, are becoming increasingly more popular, with combined sales of these products approaching $9 billion in 2022. It's the most federally used illicit drug in America. Over half of Americans have tried cannabis. Around 16% report past month use. And rates of use are highest in young adults, with 26% of young adults reporting past month use. There are over 100 different cannabinoids in the cannabis plant that have been identified. The most predominant one, of course, is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, and it's responsible for the euphoric, intoxicating, and impairing effects of cannabis. The second most commonly known cannabinoid is cannabidiol, or CBD. It is not intoxicating, and some have suggested it might modulate some of the effects of THC, including cognitively impairing effects, as well as potentially some effects on psychosis. But there's many, many, many other minor cannabinoids that we know almost nothing about. I've just started doing research on CBG, which I'm totally fascinated by. CBN and CBC are others. Now, if you've ever been into one of the many cannabis dispensaries serving the United States, you would see they carry an enormous variety of extremely high potency cannabis products. You'll see cannabis flower that can now exceed 30% THC, typically has over 20%. Concentrates that can exceed 90% THC. Then we have edibles, there's tinctures, there's lotions, there's suppositories, there's even tampons now. Yeah. And bath bombs. Importantly, research has focused almost exclusively on the effects of cannabis flower and some on edibles, and there's been almost no research examining the effects of other products, including cannabis concentrates. So as their name implies, cannabis concentrates are a highly concentrated form of the drug. They're typically produced using chemical solvents like butane, and the end product is an oil, a wax, or a resin-like substance that's heated, and the vapor is inhaled. Typically, they have over 60% THC, but as I indicated, they can exceed 90% THC. Over half of cannabis users say they've used concentrates, and about a third of them report using them on a regular basis. As I said, these are becoming increasingly more popular, with one study finding that concentrate shares in Washington state increased by 146%, while flower shares showed a slight decrease shortly after legalization. And all of this has people very concerned, because we know that higher doses of cannabis increase the detrimental outcomes. So we assume that higher potency versions of the drug will also increase these detrimental outcomes. Now, while any adult age 21 or older can walk into one of thousands of legal cannabis dispensaries across the United States and purchase a variety of high-potency cannabis products, including concentrates, the federal classification of cannabis as a Schedule I drug is mostly just keeping cannabis out of the hands of researchers. It imposes numerous legal restrictions and hurdles that have dramatically impeded research on its acute effects. So, researchers working at federally funded institutions have to spend years applying to numerous agencies before they can administer cannabis to research participants in their labs. And getting a DEA license alone can easily take 18 months. And before that, you need approvals from the FDA, the Department of Health, the IRB, and so on. And this has prevented a lot of people from studying cannabis. Further, until very recently, researchers in the US have been required to only use cannabis sourced from the NIDA drug supply for their research. And the problem, as shown on this slide, is the cannabis NIDA produces is really not at all representative of the high-potency, high-quality products that consumers are accessing and using. So the highest potency cannabis flower NIDA produces is under 12% THC. Well, again, cannabis users are accessing flower that can exceed 30% THC. NIDA only very recently started producing concentrates for human consumption. The problem is it looks like this black tar-looking substance rather than this nice little honey-colored liquid shown over here. Now, because of all of these restrictions, there has been almost no research on cannabis concentrates. So I'm going to describe a study I conducted to bypass those restrictions in order to examine the acute effects of high-potency flower and concentrates on human cognition. Just as a bit of a background, we know that one of the most robust, detrimental, acute effects of cannabis is on verbal memory, so freely recalling lists of words. This also just tends to be the predominant type of memory test used in cannabis research. And there's some very, very limited evidence that CBD might protect against the memory impairing effects of THC to sober. And we just emailed them lists of products available at our local dispensaries that met the specifications for the product they'd been randomly assigned to purchase and use. Participants all had to abstain from using cannabis on the day of the testing session. Average period of abstinence was closer to 24 hours, so they were totally sober at the onset. We did baseline measures while they were sober. Then we observed them using their product or abstaining from use over Zoom, and then we administered a series of cognitive tests over Zoom. And we compensated participants for their time, but not their cannabis purchase. I cannot buy cannabis as a researcher. Using Amazon gift cards, because at least as of today, you can't buy cannabis on Amazon. So I was able to bypass all the federal restrictions surrounding acute cannabis research because participants were legally purchasing and using cannabis in their own homes off federal property. I never purchased, I never administered, I never even touched the drug. I just observed a legal act. Actually, these ladies observed a legal act. I didn't even do that. These were our inclusion and exclusion criteria. So people had to be at least 21, reside in Washington State, where it's legal to use cannabis. They had to be fluent in English, and they had to be able to access Zoom on a secure, stable internet connection in a home environment. They had to be experienced cannabis users, and they had to have experience using both concentrates and flower. I didn't want to introduce a new version of the drug to anyone. They couldn't have any serious diagnosed or treated medical, neurological, psychiatric conditions, substance use disorders. They couldn't be using illicit drugs in the past 6 months, drink or smoke heavily, couldn't be pregnant or breastfeeding, and they had to report no serious adverse reactions to cannabis because we didn't want anyone having like a psychotic episode on Zoom when we couldn't do anything to help them. We were able to recruit 80 people who met those inclusion criteria. We randomly assigned them to one of 4 groups. So 20 were assigned to a sober control group. 20 were randomly assigned to a THC flower condition where they purchased and used a joint that had at least 20% THC and no CBD. 20 to a THC CBD flower condition where they were randomly assigned to purchase and use a joint that had at least 20% THC and some CBD. 0.7 is what we set on. We tried for much higher concentrations of CBD, but they proved exceptionally difficult to find in market products that have such high THC. It's very hard to find higher levels of CBD. And then 20 were randomly assigned to purchase and use a vape pen that had at least 70% THC and some 60% THC and some CBD. Random assignment worked to produce groups that were equivalent in every respect, all baseline demographic characteristics, cannabis use patterns, even pre-morbid verbal IQ. We recorded the number of puffs participants took, and we timed the duration of each inhalation and hold. And we found that participants randomly assigned to use that extremely high potency concentrate just took significantly fewer puffs than those smoking flower joints. They also had slightly longer inhalations. Now, by taking fewer puffs of the higher potency concentrate, they actually achieved the same subjective high as those using the flower. So everybody was totally sober at baseline, and the sober control group is down here. They remained sober the whole time. Whereas all 3 cannabis-using groups gave intoxication ratings around 6 right after use. And those were sustained throughout the duration of the study. And importantly, there were no differences in the intoxication ratings of any of the 3 cannabis-using groups at any time point. For this test, participants were shown a series of pictures and printed words on the screen, and they had to freely recall as many pictures and words as they could. And there was a significant effect of group where participants who smoked a joint containing THC and CBD recalled fewer pictures than the sober control group. Now, to assess actual source memory, remembering the source of information, participants then did a recognition test where we read them a list of words and we asked which were previously presented as pictures and which were previously presented as words. And what you can see here is now the group who used the concentrate and the group who smoked the joint that just contained THC had more errors for pictures specifically. They had worse source memory for pictures than the sober control group. We used something called the Dease-Roediger-McDermott paradigm to assess susceptibility to false memories. So here, participants listen to lists of words that are all related to a critical lure that's never presented. So we might read a list like tired, bed, dream, pillow. All these words are related to the word sleep, but we never present that critical lure. Then they do a free recall test, and they do a recognition test that includes those critical lures like sleep. It includes other related words like soft, and then it has totally unrelated words like truck. So we found another effective group where, again, those people who had the joint that contained THC and CBD once again had worse free recall than the sober control group. Then we found that participants who used the cannabis concentrate had more false memories for related words. And then all three cannabis using groups had more false memories for completely unrelated words like truck. We also administered 2 tests of prospective memory, again, our ability to remember to do things at a later time. A couple measures of temporal order memory, remembering the order in which the tests occurred. And then we had 4 measures of non-normative decision making, but we didn't find any significant effects of any of these 3 high potency products on any of these tasks. 20 per group power is not super high, so we are conducting further follow-up investigations to look for acute effects of cannabis on prospective memory, temporal order memory, and a bunch of other aspects I'll talk about at the end. We found no significant differences between the performance of those randomly assigned to use cannabis flower relative to those assigned to use a concentrate. And to me, that is the most important and encouraging finding from the study. Again, due to their extreme high potency, there's been a lot of speculation that concentrates would really magnify the harms of cannabis use. But my research instead is indicating that concentrates are not worse for cognition than flower. Instead, we just see people self-titrate their use of these extremely high potency concentrates. They use a lot less of it and achieve the same level of intoxication and the same level of impairment as those using flower. Now, the primary limitation of this study is the lack of a placebo control group. Some of these effects could represent expectancy effects instead of true drug effects. I opted not to control the smoking session to reduce my legal risks, so we did not control their dose, but that led to that really interesting finding that, again, they just self-titrated. They used a lot less. And then finally, we relied on samples of experienced cannabis users who are using cannabis in their familiar, comfortable home environment instead of a lab environment, and that could have reduced our sensitivity to detect some effects. Now, one of the biggest strengths of this study is we were able to bypass the U.S. federal restrictions on acute cannabis research in a manner that resulted in very high ecological validity. So we could examine the high potency products like concentrates that people are actually using in their typical manner of use in their home environments. And it was also extremely cost effective. This was a very cheap study. Okay, so next I'm going to describe a different method that we've used to bypass these restrictions on studying high potency cannabis to look at acute effects of cannabis on mental health. Now, generally speaking, there is a great deal of evidence demonstrating an increased prevalence of psychological disorders in chronic cannabis users. And a lot of people have historically tended to interpret this to indicate that cannabis use increases the risk of developing a psychological disorder. But people are now starting to recognize that part of these associations is due to the use of cannabis to self-medicate for psychological disorders. Indeed, some of my very early research indicated that the top 3 reasons medical cannabis patients were indicating they're using cannabis were pain, depression, and anxiety. It's still a little unclear if these links mean cannabis is increasing the risk of psychological disorders or psychological disorders are increasing the risk of cannabis use, or more likely there's some sort of a So I wanted to examine whether acute cannabis intoxication would significantly reduce symptoms of various psychological disorders. I wanted to examine whether THC CBD concentrations or dose would predict the size of those symptom reductions. And I wanted to explore potential longer-term consequences of using cannabis to manage psychological disorders. Specifically, I wanted to look at if repeatedly using cannabis to manage these symptoms would increase or decrease their severity in the longer term. And I was able to examine acute effects of cannabis on mental health without a DEA license simply by analyzing archival data from a medical cannabis app called StrainPrint. This app allows patients to indicate the symptoms they're actively experiencing before they self-medicate with cannabis. They rate the severity of those symptoms using 0 to 10 scales. They indicate the strain and source of that strain that they're about to use, and the app actually pulls data from licensed producers' websites to get THC and CBD concentrations. They input the method of administration. We only look at inhalation methods because we can capture the period of intoxication more easily. They input their dose, and for inhalation, that's number of puffs. And then they can re-rate their symptom severity. And because we know cannabis impairs memory, there's a push notification that reminds them to re-rate their symptoms 20 minutes after use. And what's really nice about the app is that patients repeatedly use the app along with different products, different doses, different methods of administration. So we can look at those effects, and we can also look at effects over time. I'm going to present findings from 4 separate studies, starting with the first one I conducted with my first PhD student, Alexander Spradlin. So the crimson bars show average symptom ratings before cannabis use, and the gray bars show ratings shortly after use. So here, this was a very large-scale study. As you can see, this is a nice thing of getting global big app data like this. So it involved thousands of cannabis use sessions over the span of a year. Yeah?
So this is from the app, is that correct? And do you know what measure of depression and anxiety?
How they're asking about their mood and their anxiety. So they're just rate on a 0 to 10 scale.
So it's not like a validated measure of...
Oh, it's an app, so no, we can't give them like a whole like clinical interview or anything like that. They're asking about their mood before and after use.
There are validated questionnaires that could be used, so they're not using those validated.
No, this is just an app asking for patients to understand their symptom change with different products, to find the products that they are most beneficial to them. So we're seeing 50% reductions in subjective symptom ratings of depression, and we're seeing 58% reductions in ratings of anxiety from immediately before to after cannabis use. I then worked with my grad students, Emily LaFrance and Nicholas Glodowski, to examine changes in flashbacks, intrusive thoughts, and irritability in a sample of people with PTSD over the span of 3 years. And we found 51% reductions in the severity of flashbacks, 62% reductions in intrusive thoughts, and 67% reductions in irritability. One of my grad students was really interested in OCD, so we looked at a sample of patients with OCD. We saw, again, roughly 50% reductions in the severity of intrusions, 60% reductions in compulsions, and about 50% reductions in anxiety.
Is the rating always after the 20-minute push? So every single one of these?
No, they can rate it before that or after that, and we cap it at no more than 4 hours after. So if they gave the rating 6 hours later, we don't include them because the cannabis wouldn't be on board at all at that point. And then finally, I most recently worked with Emily LaFrance and Deb Carson to look at data from a sample of adults with autism. And we looked at sensitivity symptoms like touch sensitivity and sound sensitivity. Those were reduced by 68%. Ratings of their severity of repetitive behaviors like stimming and limb flapping were reduced by 70%. Ratings of problems with mental control which was difficulty concentrating and intrusions. Those were reduced by 69%. And ratings of negative affect, including irritability and anxiety, were reduced by 76%. By and large, we're seeing about 50% reductions in the subjective ratings of their symptoms. We use multi-level modeling and latent change score models to examine predictors of symptom change. Oh, yeah.
Sorry. On the previous slide.
Mm-hmm.
Can you use that?
You can just repeat the question for the audience. But I'm just very struck by the fact that it's like this.
I'm going to get there. I know it is. I'll get there.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree with you. That's remarkably consistent. We see the same with physical pain too. Something's up. I agree. Yeah. So we looked at predictors of these changes, and we found that products higher in CBD and lower in THC predicted larger reductions in depression. Higher CBD predicted larger reductions in OCD compulsions. And then higher doses predicted larger reductions in intrusions in people with PTSD, as well as larger reductions in repetitive behaviors and mental control and negative affect in people with autism. And I'll also note we found that people with PTSD were using higher doses over time. Their dose was escalating. We didn't see that with any other condition, just PTSD. And then we attempted to explore the potential effects of repeatedly using cannabis to manage symptoms of psychological disorders by tracking the baseline severity ratings over time. So we're just looking before they use cannabis, what's going on with their depression ratings over time. And we found that baseline symptoms of depression were increasing over time as a function of the repeated use of cannabis to manage those symptoms. Which suggests that cannabis might exacerbate depression over time. And then similarly, in our most recent paper, in the autistic adults, we found baseline symptoms of negative affect and repetitive behaviors were increasing over time as a function of using cannabis, suggesting cannabis may be aggravating these symptoms over time. We didn't find changes in ratings of any other baseline symptom over time, though, suggesting that repeatedly using cannabis is not making these conditions better or worse over time, but it might just be maintaining them over time. So to summarize, acute cannabis intoxication appears to alleviate symptoms of depression, anxiety, OCD, and PTSD in the short term by about 50%. And to get to this point, I do not think cannabis is directly affecting any of these symptoms. I think it generally makes people less distressed about everything. Physical and emotional pain, they care less about, they feel less distressed about, they're about 50% better overall. Yeah.
Is it possible that cannabis is just like slowing down people's thoughts overall, because like each of these thoughts that they have, anxiety or they repeated behavior, and if you just like slow down the processing of the cortex through cannabinoid receptors?
I don't know that that's been looked at or found. I'm not sure if that's it, but I know from talking to pain patients, though, that they'll say that the pain is still there. They don't care about the pain anymore. And I think it's the same for emotional pain. The symptom is there. They don't care. They're not bothered by it. It's the emotional entanglement of the symptom goes away and is mitigated, so they feel better. It's not that they are treating the symptom. They just feel less distressed generally. They feel better. So the repeated use of cannabis to manage these symptoms is maintaining them or exacerbating them, right? As we saw with depression, it's not making them better in the long term. There was limited evidence that people developed tolerance. Dose did remain pretty static, except for PTSD, where we did see these dose escalations. And that might have been because higher doses were predicting larger symptom reductions in people with PTSD. Limitation of these studies is, again, lack of placebo control group, of course. So we are not controlling for people's expectations of the impacts of cannabis use on mental health. I'm sure there's a placebo effect in here. And this is why I've tried to frame these results as more subjective. These are not objective indicators of these mental health conditions. Nevertheless, collectively, they indicate that people perceive there are short-term beneficial effects of cannabis on mental health, but there's no long-term benefits of using cannabis to manage these symptoms. The findings indicate to me that cannabis is a bit of a Band-Aid. It's temporarily masking symptoms. It's not addressing the root core issue underlying these conditions. So people experiencing these symptoms of psychological disorders may turn to cannabis and they find it makes them feel better in the short term, making it negatively reinforcing. It's not doing anything in the long term. It's just maintaining or exacerbating their symptoms. So when the high wears off, the symptoms return, meaning they have to go back to cannabis to self-medicate, which is going to increase their risk of developing a cannabis use disorder. As such, people experiencing anxiety, depression, OCD, PTSD should really seek out things like cognitive behavioral therapy to learn how to manage these symptoms in the long term. Okay, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the stress response next. So stress is clearly a major precipitating factor of many psychological disorders, and the endocannabinoid system is known to help orchestrate the HPA axis. So I'm going to describe a few studies on differences in chronic cannabis users' stress response. So here I get past the laws just by not giving people cannabis. We're just bringing them in the lab sober. So the nation is clearly experiencing unprecedented levels of stress as the realities of climate change, systemic racism, the COVID pandemic, and major political divides have all come to the forefront of public attention in recent years. And this is concerning because even prior to 2020, over 75% of Americans reported physical and emotional symptoms of stress. And those recent surges in cannabis sales I showed you at the beginning of my talk suggest that many people may be turning to the new legal cannabis market to cope with all of that stress. And indeed, we know that stress plays a critical role in addiction, and the most commonly reported reason for cannabis use is to cope with stress. And the reason people turn to cannabis for stress relief is, again, it's perceived as highly effective. So in a strain print study, we found once again 58% reductions in self-reported stress from right before to after inhaling cannabis. These stress-relieving effects contribute again to its reinforcing properties. People feel better when they're high, and continued use of the drug for coping. However, using cannabis to cope with stress is associated with negative outcomes, including problematic cannabis use, symptoms of cannabis use disorder, and negative affect, including depression. And that suggests that the acute stress-relieving effects of cannabis may be overshadowed by increased susceptibility to problematic use and depression stemming from chronic use of the drug. Now, given that cannabis is commonly used to cope with stress, and we know it has acute stress-relieving properties, me and several collaborators set out to examine whether chronic cannabis users would respond differently to an acute stressor in a controlled laboratory environment. So we had a sample of non-users and a sample of sober cannabis users come to the lab. Half of each of these groups was randomly assigned to a stress condition. So here they had to go through repeated trials of putting their hand in ice water for unpredictable lengths of time. In between those trials, we made them count backwards from 2043 by 17s. And any time they made an error, every time they made an error, we told them, no, you're wrong, start again. And meanwhile, there's a webcam right in front of them projecting their image onto a monitor right in front of them. So they have to watch themselves undergoing all of this. For the no-stress condition, we just had them put their hand in and out of lukewarm water for the same amounts of time. They counted from 1 to 10. No one made any mistakes. It was fine. There was no webcam. There was no feedback. So what you can see here is we demonstrated a significant effect of the stress manipulation in the non-users, shown in blue, right? This is what you'd expect. Cortisol increased in the stress condition, went down a bit in the no-stress condition. In contrast, the change in cortisol in the cannabis users and the stress and no-stress conditions were the same. We also saw a significant interaction between the stress condition and cannabis use status on subjective stress ratings. Again, this difference in the subjective stress ratings of non-users in the stress and no stress conditions is much bigger than this difference between cannabis users in these two conditions. We call this blunted stress reactivity in chronic cannabis users. Yeah.
What were the baseline core values?
Oh, I can't remember off the top of my head. They'd be in my paper.
Similar or?
Oh, I see. I'm going to actually show you data with baseline court data. You'll see this in a different study. You'll get a sense of that. Slightly higher we see sometimes, but not necessarily significantly higher depending on this study. In this one, there wasn't a significant difference at baseline. Now, the primary limitation of this study is, well, we can't randomly assign people to be cannabis users or non-users, right? So we can't establish the causal nature, and we couldn't establish the direction of the effect. We didn't know if cannabis use was blunting stress cortisol reactivity, or if blunted cortisol reactivity is a risk factor for cannabis use, right? Maybe they're seeking out stimulation through cannabis. So my husband and collaborator Ryan McLaughlin and I decided to follow up this study using a back translational approach with our joint student Nicholas Glodowski. So he subjected rats to a restraint stress challenge and looked at their court reactivity. Then he used a novel rodent vapor self-administration model where rodents could self-administer puffs of 3 potencies of cannabis extract or vehicle free of THC for an hour a day for 30 days to model chronic cannabis use. Then we subjected rats to that restraint stress again under sober conditions. We found that stress reactivity before self-administration did not predict rates of self-administration, suggesting it's not blunted court reactivity that's causing the cannabis use. More importantly, by looking at changes in court reactivity from before to after the 30 days of self-administration, we found a medium dose of cannabis blunted court reactivity in female rodents, which provides evidence that chronic use of cannabis can blunt the court response. There's a clear sex difference here we need to further examine. We thought maybe it relates to the fact that the females self-administered way more cannabis than the males did. But actually a human paper came out replicating my finding but showing it was also specific in females, which is really interesting. So Nick, Ryan, and I later published a review paper looking at acute and chronic effects of cannabinoid exposure on the neuroendocrine stress response of rodents and humans. And in reviewing that literature, we found that, most people were doing what we did, right? Looking at a limited number of stress-related endpoints, cortisol, before and after an acute stress manipulation in a controlled lab environment. And no one had been really trying to figure out any of the implications of the dysregulation in the stress response on things like mental health. So for this study, we assessed diurnal rhythms in multiple physiological indicators of stress. So we have cortisol, heart rate variability, and electrodermal activity in cannabis users and non-users, and we measure these over a 24-hour period in their own natural environments, in their own home environments, while they go about their day. And we also have a measure of depression, the Beck Depression Inventory, to try to see if any of this correlates with symptoms of depression. So we had 39 chronic cannabis users and 43 non-users wear this Empatica E4 wristband for 24 hours in their natural environments as they went about their day-to-day lives. And it measured heart rate variability, electrodermal activity. And they also collected saliva samples throughout the day to look at their cortisol slopes. They also completed the Beck Depression Inventory because we know people with depression tend to have dysregulations in cortisol. Cannabis users appear to be more vulnerable to depression, so we wanted to see if the dysregulations in cortisol were predicting their depression. These results are hot off the presses. He literally analyzed these data last month, and they show that cannabis users have somewhat flattened diurnal cortisol slopes. So the difference between the peak and the end point is shallower significantly in cannabis users than it is in non-users. You can also see here, cannabis users don't have a cortisol awakening response. So cortisol should increase in the first 30 minutes after waking, and you can see this in the non-users in blue here. In contrast, cannabis users do not have that increase in cortisol upon awakening. This figure here just shows their subjective stress ratings at the exact same time point, so them rating how stressed they feel, and we didn't find any significant differences in subjective stress ratings. So your question about basal quart, you can see it's up at one time point in the day, and that's it. We did not detect any significant relationships between depression and either of these cortisol dysregulations. The results from the wristbands are still being processed. We've got like computer scientists doing machine learning algorithms with that, so I don't have those data. We also asked cannabis users to take cortisol samples and give stress ratings right before and after they used cannabis in their own homes. And as you can see here, both cortisol and subjective stress ratings were significantly reduced after cannabis use in people's natural environments, which is consistent with the fact that people are using cannabis to cope with stress and, again, report that it's beneficial in the short term. But it's inconsistent with lab studies indicating that cortisol increases when you give cannabis to people in the lab. And again, I think that's potentially because using cannabis in a foreign lab environment while being observed is probably a bit more stressful for cannabis users than using it in their comfortable, familiar home environment. So to summarize, chronic use of cannabis appears to blunt cortisol reactivity and subjective responses to acute stress. It appears to disrupt the cortisol awakening response and is associated with flatter diurnal cortisol slopes. Acute cannabis intoxication is reducing cortisol and subjective stress, which would reinforce its use for coping. Now, contrary to our expectations, these disruptions in cortisol were completely uncorrelated to depression. So the implications of these perturbations in cortisol are still entirely unclear, and I definitely welcome your thoughts and input there. So collectively, the results indicate that chronic cannabis use is fundamentally altering the neuroendocrine response to stress. I'm going to close today by briefly mentioning a couple of the studies that I am currently doing that build off of these. I'm going to go through this one faster than I was planning on, but we are combining my research on mental health and cognition to try to look at the effects of chronic and acute cannabis use on cognition in people with ADHD, as well as on ADHD symptom ratings. And that's because a lot of people with ADHD say they use cannabis because they think it helps them. And so we're trying to look at their subjective ratings of their symptoms, but also objective indicators of inhibition and attention and whatnot. The study just closed, and roughly what we're finding is that when people with ADHD are high, they say their symptoms are all better. On every objective measure, they are not any better at all. We consistently see, I was talking to Nicole this morning, we consistently see these dissociations between subjective and objective indicators in cannabis users. They seem to be out of touch or something with themselves, and they think that they're better at a lot of things, and they're not actually doing any better. Right? And same with pain. They say, oh, my pain feels better, but you can't get it on an objective measure of pain often. And then finally, Ryan, my husband Ryan McLaughlin and I just launched a laboratory-controlled study of the acute effects of cannabis on memory in the munchies, M&M study. So we're looking at the acute effects of cannabis on multiple memory domains. Again, prospective memory, temporal order memory, false memory, source memory, visual, spatial memory, all of it, right? Using a double-blind placebo control between subjects design. So we're randomly assigning people to vape that night of cannabis or NIDA placebo in the basement of the psych department using this volcano. NIDA has provided us with their highest potency cannabis flower, It's 11.86% THC. After they vape 20 milligrams, 40 milligrams, or placebo, I administer an hour-long battery of memory tests. So we can try to figure out which aspects of memory are impaired and which are spared, because it doesn't seem to be uniformly affected, but people haven't looked at a lot of these domains of memory. Now, we have to keep people in the lab for a full 4 hours after they vape, so I don't want to give them any more than an hour of memory test. That's already a lot. So I changed my conference lab room to a chill-out room. It's a living room. We got a PlayStation, Cannabis books, a TV where they can stream Netflix, and then we have a shelf of a whole bunch of snacks, and then a little fridge with beverages and more snacks, and we are like, have whatever you want, go at it, you know? And then there's a one-way mirror, looks like a mirror by the snacks. We are watching them. On the other side of the mirror, we're recording all of their food consumption, calorie intake, macros intake. And we go in every half an hour, we get intoxication ratings, and we ask them how tasty everything was too. Like, how much did you enjoy those M&Ms on a scale of 0 to 10? So we're gonna look at correlations between like food intake and calorie intake and intoxication ratings, but also just, you know, see if they find food tastier when they're high, which they should. And that study is fully approved now by the IRB, FDA, and DEA. So just to quickly summarize the key take-home messages from this compilation of studies. Yes, it's possible to bypass the US federal restrictions and study the acute effects of high-potency cannabis. You just need to get a little creative. Acute use of high-potency cannabis and flower and concentrates has similar detrimental effects on memory. Acute cannabis intoxication provides short-term, but not long-term, benefits on mental health. And finally, the regular use of cannabis appears to alter the neuroendocrine stress response, although the implications of this remain rather unclear. So I'd just like to thank the grad students in my lab, past and present, who helped with all these projects, WSU's Alcohol and Drug Abuse Research Program, and WSU's dedicated marijuana account for funding most of these studies. Funds from these accounts come from the sales of liquor licenses and recreational cannabis in our state. And then finally, I'd like to thank you for being here to learn about my research. And Nicole, thank you for inviting me here today.
So this came from Leslie's question, but you know, if you use something like the general anxiety scales or the Beck, et cetera, while they are intoxicated or not, will they actually rate the same, do you think?
Don't know.
You don't think so?
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure. Typically, visual analog scale sort of indicators of these are used in this kind of research rather than like very like exhaustive and complete measures that are looking at all the different symptoms specifically. Yeah. And again, I don't think that it is helping all the specific symptoms. So I don't know if you would find that, right? Like, I don't think, like, and the Beck depression inventories over the past 2 weeks, it's not designed to be done as an acute thing, right? So that makes it difficult. There is like the state trait anxiety inventory, so the state form of that inventory you could potentially use. But again, I don't think that it's that they feel less jittery, that they feel less strained, that they feel less confused. I think they just feel less anxious, how they perceive it as a global impression, because I don't think it's doing anything to all the specific symptoms. So I don't think you would necessarily find something using that. It's affecting their global impression of their state. So they feel better. That's what they know. I feel less distressed generally, and they map that onto whatever it was that was bothering them. That's what I think.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Actually, I have a study where we gave people CBG. We did a double-blind placebo-controlled trial of CBG, cannabidiol, and we find that it reduces anxiety ratings, but the state form, no, it doesn't do anything to their scores on the state form of the state trait anxiety inventory, because it has those specific terms, jittery, confused, strained, tense. we didn't see an effect on that, but when we just asked them, what's your level of anxiety right now? That profoundly went down.
With the memory test, do you have any information on, I don't really know if it's like motivation to perform before they inhale the THC? Because you were saying that a lot of your results seem to point to them not caring so much. So
About their symptom. Yeah.
Do you see them maybe not caring so much if they perform well on the testing too? for the
Actually,
memory
we
test,
worry
or no?
the opposite is happening. We worry that they are working so much harder on the cognitive tests to show that cannabis isn't impairing, because they don't want science to find cannabis as bad. So I think the opposite happens, that they are working harder, and there is some brain imaging research that corroborates that statement, that shows that they are putting more effort into the task to perform at the same outcome. And I have a new colleague at WSU with experience doing FNIRS research. So I'm trying to get her FNIRS, and to do that, because you can get an indicator of cognitive effort while they're doing the tasks to help understand that. And I think that would be fascinating.
Hi, thank you. It was a great presentation. Have you considered looking at people who have chronic illnesses? They may have more emotional intelligence around their pain levels, or whether or not it helps with nausea. You know, looking at groups that have long-term chronic illnesses, do you think you might have different results on self-awareness?
I'm not sure. Like I said, we just see these disconnects between subjective and objective in cannabis users. Even the first study that I showed you with the cortisol, so we tried to correlate their change in cortisol with their change in their subjective stress ratings, and just generally subjective stress ratings and cortisol correlations. You'd think there should be a correlation, right? Yeah, there is in non-users, not in cannabis users. Zero correlation between subjective stress ratings and cortisol. I don't think that like a greater level of expertise with the medical symptom is necessarily going to help them. I mean, I saw this too. I had a woman in recently, and we do a driving impairment app called Druid with them when they're sober and high. And she struggled with it when she was sober. I was like, I'm a little nervous about this. Like, what's going on here? She seems to be struggling. But she goes through the app, and then I went in and vaped her, brought her back, gave her the app again, and she was like, oh no. And I was like, yeah. And then she started doing the app, and she's like, oh, I think I'm doing so much better this time. It's really going well for me now. Like, now I'm great. And I was like, okay, sure, let's see about that. And she shows me her score, and I'm like, no, you're impaired. You are significantly impaired now, whereas you were way lower and not impaired at all before. There seems to be a disconnect between subjective and objective.
Oh. Have you examined any age differences?
Yes, I just put a grant in last week, an R01, to look at this. So one of the early studies I did was just looking at chronic cannabis users' cognition. So when they were sober, just looking at chronic effects of cannabis use. And just serendipitously, I happened to notice in my data that while non-cannabis users show the typical age-related declines in cognition across the lifespan, cannabis users are flat through the entire lifespan. And I was like, oh, what? No, it can't be right. This can't. Then I looked at the rodent literature. There's a rodent literature to indicate the same thing. If you give old mice THC for a period of time, their memory performance becomes like young mice now. Yeah. So I'm fascinated by that. So I just submitted an R01. That was, again, serendipitous. I wasn't looking for old people for that study, so it wasn't properly designed to answer this question. So I put in an R01 to try to look at age-related differences in cognition across the lifespan in users and non-users. And then for AIM-2, I was like, well, let's just get them high, too. We'll go ahead and have an acute AIM and look at the acute effects of cannabis on, right, like 20-year-olds relative to like 60-year-olds, for instance. And I think, and all the literature and all my hypotheses are that, yes, cannabis is more detrimental early in life Midlife, it's kind of just not doing much of anything. And then later in life, it may be beneficial.
Okay, so I think it was in the study with the app, like on mental health and like acute effects of THC use. The slide that had the results for depression, which increased over time. Do you have any idea like why that might be if these were already chronic users? Because it looked like it might be like because like the more THC use, you know, accumulated throughout the year, like their depression is going up, but like so much can happen in a year to like cause that. So I was just curious.
Yeah, definitely. There's actually been meta-analyses of longitudinal studies. There's 2 meta-analyses of longitudinal studies that corroborate these findings and show that cannabis use over time is predicting increases in depression, but not anxiety, just depression. And we think it's because the endocannabinoid system is actually involved in regulating mood, and it has antidepressant effects. If you activate the endocannabinoid system in animals, we see sort of like antidepressant-like effects in rodents, right? So the endogenous system is serving as a bit of an antidepressant. Now, you blast that system with THC all the time, what happens to it is it desensitizes. And so now it's not naturally functioning as well and providing that protection against depression. This goes with the short-term beneficial effects, long-term detrimental. You're just desensitizing that system.
Do you collect data concerning stimulant use such as caffeine, and whether there are any trends in the individuals that are non-users versus chronic users, things along those lines?
I have not looked at caffeine, no. I usually rule out high levels of nicotine use in my studies, but I have not looked at caffeine or ever considered that, no. Why?
Well, just thinking about, you know, the various ends where, one, you are trying to put in the stimulants to be able versus to be able to kind of suppress. And so I just didn't know whether there are any trends in terms of caffeine consumption or other stimulant consumption in association then with either non-users or users.
Yeah, no, I haven't considered it at all. I mean, just stimulants with respect to like ADHD medications and whatnot, which we, again, aren't really seeing interactions with cannabis use and ADHD.
It's all right. Yes. All right, last question. Oh, I had 2 and a half. I don't know if what you were saying earlier kind of answered it. I was going to ask, do you have any plans to look at memory changes over time? And that's not exactly the same as age-related.
Yeah, no, it's not.
I don't care if my memory is impaired while I'm high, but 5, 10, whatever years later.
Yeah, no, I haven't. I personally don't want to do longitudinal studies because it takes too long and I'm too impatient. So other people can do the longitudinal studies. I like the quick results. I want to know the answers right away. So personally, no, but yes, it's really important. Someone should do it. It's not going to be me, but somebody should do that. I think that that's very important. What we do know is that if people abstain from cannabis use for 30 days, the memory differences, and I don't call them impairments because they're not big enough to be impairments, right? They're remembering 1 or 2 words fewer on a list. This is not an amnesia. Yeah. And so they do find that the differences in memory go away after 30 days of abstinence because the CB1 receptors go back to normal functioning after about 30 days of abstinence. So it's not like a permanent brain damage or amnesia like you would get with like chronic use of alcohol and Korsakoff's or something.
Okay. And my other question was in regards to the blunted stress response, where stress is something where too much and too little can be bad. And my sense was, hey, a blunted stress response sounds great as a grad student. Is that, like, do you have a sense on whether it's like
problematically reduced or?
Well, yeah, so this is the thing, is we just don't know. So when we went into that study, again, this was one of the first studies I collaborated with my husband on, and he was like, we're going to find less stress reactivity. And I'm like, no, we're going to find more, because you just took their coping mechanism away from them, right? They are used to coping with stress by getting high, and we're not going to let them get high. So their cortisol is going to go up. The man was right. Hard to admit that, but he was right. And then I was like, oh, so it's good, right? Like, even when you're not high, you're protected against stress. And he's like, no, Carrie, there's a reason why cortisol comes on board when you're stressed, right? So it helps to mobilize you to deal with the stress. So it has an important adaptive function. So he's like, it's not a good thing. And I'm like, but maybe it is a good thing. He's like, it's not a good thing. We just can't find if it's a good or bad thing or what it actually predicts or maps onto. So we've started to look in the literature, right, to see what dysregulations in cortisol are related to what physical and mental health conditions. And again, depression was our #1 candidate here, because people with depression have a lot of dysregulations. And again, we can't find it. So I'm not sure, and we'll just keep doing research to figure that out.
Thanks, Carrie. Apparently there were over 30 people online, but there was some network glitch, so that was cut off, but we were able to continue recording, so we'll piece together the pieces and send it out to those that were here. So thank you, great attendance today. Thank you, everyone.